A captured German officer stood on a ridge above the Norman hedgerows in August 1944, watching an endless column of dust rise from a road he thought his own engineers had rendered impassable. What rolled past wasn't a handful of supply wagons. It was a river of trucks, thousands of them, moving day and night without pause. He later told his interrogators, according to Allied intelligence summaries, that this single sight convinced him the war was already lost. Not the tanks, not the aircraft overhead, the trucks. For an army that had spent years perfecting the image of mechanized blitzkrieg, the Wehrmacht was, by 1944, still desperately dependent on horses. Roughly 750,000 horses served the German army at the height of the war, more than Napoleon ever used in Russia. So when German soldiers began capturing, inspecting, and sometimes driving American trucks, what they found wasn't just impressive, it was disorienting. Here are 7 things about American trucks that genuinely astonished the men who fought against them. The first shock was simply how many there were. German logistics planners worked in a world of scarcity, where every liter of fuel and every spare tire was rationed and fought over. The American Army, by contrast, seemed to manufacture transport the way a factory manufactures nails. Between 1941 and 1945, the United States produced more than 2.5 million military trucks. The workhorse of this fleet was the GMC CCKW, nicknamed the Jimmy by American GIs, a 2.5-ton, 6-wheel drive truck built in numbers exceeding 560,000 units. To put that in perspective, Germany's entire truck park across the whole war numbered in the hundreds of thousands, and much of it consisted of captured or requisitioned civilian vehicles from occupied France, Czechoslovakia, and elsewhere, dozens of incompatible makes and models that turned every repair depot into a nightmare of mismatched parts. German mechanics interviewed after the war described this chaos as a logistical Tower of Babel, a phrase used loosely by post-war historians to capture what quartermasters actually lived through. The Americans, meanwhile, ran a fleet built almost entirely around a handful of standardized designs. One German prisoner captured near St. Lo reportedly asked his interrogator, with something between admiration and disbelief, how many factories in America existed only to build trucks. The honest answer was dozens running around the clock. The second surprise came from the truck's construction itself. German soldiers who examined a downed or abandoned CCKW often remarked on how simple and rugged it seemed compared to their own vehicles. German trucks, particularly the Opel Blitz and various commandeered French Citroëns, were engineered with a certain mechanical elegance, precise tolerances, and components that performed beautifully under ideal conditions, but proved fragile in mud, cold, or sand. American trucks were engineered for something else entirely: survivability under abuse. The CCKW used a straightforward 6-cylinder engine, a 2-speed transfer case, and part-time all-wheel drive that let a private with minimal training keep it running with a wrench and a prayer. Studebaker's US-6, another mass-produced 2.5-ton truck, saw over 190,000 units shipped to the Soviet Union alone under Lend-Lease, and Red Army drivers came to prize it precisely because it forgave rough treatment that would have destroyed a European truck. German mechanics who captured these vehicles for their own use, which happened more often than official histories like to admit, found them almost insultingly easy to maintain. There was no delicate machining to babysit, no rare part that had to be shipped from a single specialized plant. Everything about the design screamed mass production, and mass production, it turned out, won wars. Third, there was the sheer smoothness of the drivetrain in bad terrain. German soldiers accustomed to their own trucks bogging down in the mud of the Eastern Front, the infamous Rasputitsa season that stopped entire divisions cold, were startled by how effectively American 4-wheel and 6-wheel drive systems handled soft or broken ground. During the Normandy campaign, hedgerow country turned into a churned morass of clay and rain within days of the invasion, yet American supply columns kept moving. Captured German officers noted this with a kind of professional envy in post-war debriefings, observing that Allied trucks pushed through conditions that would have stranded a blitz for hours. Part of this came down to tire design and axle configuration, but part of it came down to raw engineering philosophy. Build a vehicle that assumes the road will disappear beneath it, because eventually it will. The fourth revelation was more psychological than mechanical, and it had to do with the Jeep. To German soldiers first encountering the Willys MB or 4GPW in North Africa and later in Sicily and Normandy, this small, open, seemingly flimsy vehicle looked almost like a joke next to the heavier Kübelwagen. Yet the Jeep could do things the Kübelwagen simply couldn't. It could tow a 37mm anti-tank gun, ford small streams, carry a stretcher rack for wounded men, and be repaired by virtually any mechanic in the field, because so many of its parts were interchangeable across the entire production run. German infantry who captured jeeps, and thousands were captured and pressed into German service throughout the war, often praised their agility while marveling that something so lightly built could survive the punishment American drivers put it through. One German veteran, recalling his unit's experience in Italy, in an account historians treat as broadly representative of soldier sentiment rather than a verified direct quote, described the jeep as a mule that never tired and never complained, a comparison that would have resonated deeply with an army, still relying on actual mules and horses to move supplies through mountain passes. Fifth came something subtler: standardization down to the bolt. German soldiers who serviced captured American vehicles kept discovering that a wrench or spare part taken from one truck fit almost identically onto another truck built at a completely different factory, sometimes on the opposite side of the country. This wasn't accidental. The U.S. Army's Ordnance Department had spent years before the war pushing manufacturers toward common specifications, common electrical systems, even common paint procedures, so that a supply depot in Cherbourg could service a truck built in Michigan without improvising. German industry, fractured by competing corporate interests and a Nazi bureaucracy that often prized rivalry over cooperation, never achieved anything close to this level of uniformity. A supply officer with the 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich, moving through France in the summer of 1944, is recorded in post-war accounts as having complained about the impossibility of finding spare parts for half the requisitioned vehicles in his column, since French, Czech, and German trucks all used different specifications. American forces, by contrast, could cannibalize a wrecked truck for parts almost anywhere along their supply chain and keep the column moving within hours. The sixth astonishment concerned fuel and lubricants, an unglamorous subject that turned out to matter enormously. German engines were frequently tuned to run on higher octane fuel than what was reliably available by the later years of the war, especially after Allied bombing campaigns targeted synthetic fuel plants at places like Luna and Pölitz, starting in 1944. American trucks, engineered with wider tolerances, could run reasonably well on a broader range of fuel qualities and captured German technical reports, occasionally noted with something like frustration how forgiving American engines seemed to be about fuel inconsistency. This mattered enormously as the war ground on and German fuel supplies collapsed. By the time of the Ardennes offensive in December 1944, entire panzer columns were being planned around the hope of capturing Allied fuel dumps, a desperate gamble that failed when American forces destroyed or relocated stockpiles ahead of the German advance. The irony wasn't lost on German drivers who, in the final push of that campaign, found themselves eyeing captured American trucks, not just for their cargo capacity, but because they seemed to run on almost anything you poured into the tank. The seventh and perhaps most sobering realization was about scale and rhythm, the sense that these trucks represented an entirely different theory of warfare. The Red Ball Express, the famous truck convoy system organized after the fall of Paris in August 1944, moved roughly 12,000 tons of supplies a day at its peak, using nearly 6,000 vehicles running around the clock along one-way loop roads stretching from Normandy to the front lines near the German border. German intelligence officers who studied Allied logistics, and some did so obsessively, understood that this wasn't just impressive engineering. It was a statement about industrial capacity that Germany could never hope to match. Albert Speer, Germany's armaments minister, wrote in post-war reflections about the overwhelming material superiority the Allies brought to the Western Front, a superiority visible in nothing so plainly as in the endless convoys of trucks that never seemed to run out of fuel, tires, or replacement parts. But for a German soldier standing in a bombed-out village watching that convoy pass, truck after truck after truck, the realization dawned slowly but unmistakably. This was not a war of tactics anymore. It was a war of factories, and one side had far more of them. What makes these 7 observations so haunting in hindsight isn't just the mechanical detail, though the detail matters. It's what the trucks represented to the men who saw them up close. A soldier can be told, in briefings and propaganda reels, that the enemy is running low on everything, that victory is still within reach if the front holds just a little longer. But when that same soldier watches an American 6x6 grind through mud that swallowed his own vehicles whole, when he strips a Jeep for parts and finds 5 more identical Jeeps within a mile, when he realizes that the enemy's spare tire fits a truck built 1,000 miles away from the one it came off, something shifts. It isn't fear exactly, it's arithmetic. And arithmetic, in the end, proved harder to argue with than any general's orders. Historians still debate which single factor did the most to break German resistance in the West: air superiority, fuel shortages, sheer manpower, or the collapse of German industry under sustained bombing. But ask the men who were there, the infantrymen and mechanics who actually touched these machines with their own hands, and a surprising number point to something almost embarrassingly mundane. Not the tanks, not the guns, the trucks, The unglamorous, boxy, endlessly reproducible trucks that never stopped coming, mile after mile, convoy after convoy, until an entire army built on speed and audacity found itself outrun by something it never expected to fear: American logistics, moving forward one gear change at a time, and never once running out of road.